episode of Quick and Dirty Yoga Philosophy. My name is Molly Lanning Kenny, and this time we're going to talk about the Yamas. And the Yamas are one of the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm going to write that down, Yama. And it's one of the 8 limbs of yoga. And in fact, it's the very first limb. And the Yamas are considered part of the ethical precepts of the practice of yoga. In the 8 limbs of yoga, the first 2 limbs are both these ethical precepts. There's Yama, which are considered to be the restraints. And then there's Niyama, which are considered to be the observances. Our next episode, we'll talk about Niyama, the observances. This one we're going to talk about Yama. So again, it's the very first limb of the 8 limbs of yoga. Yama actually has 5 different aspects to it. So we could say like 5 sub-limbs. And these are considered to be the very foundations upon which we build our yoga practice. So even if you're thinking about just being in yoga class or teaching yoga class, and you're sort of equating the idea of yoga with yoga asana, the movement and the postures, you can still think about these ethical precepts and how they might play out. In fact, one of the things that I like to think about as a yoga teacher, as well as a yoga student, is when I think about any of the yamas, any of these precepts, I like to think of myself about how they actually play out on the mat, but also how they play out in the real world. And so really, I think about these so much that I could practically have I could maybe take an entire 20 minutes just to talk about one of the limbs, because there's so many different ways we can think about them and nuance them. And in fact, I think it's part of our evolution and our maturation is to be able to recognize these different ethical precepts, these tenets, and think about, okay, what's their like most superficial, most literal kind of meaning, and then kind of going further and further and deeper with them. In fact, it's often talked about, and particularly I'm thinking about the translation of the Yoga Sutras by Swami Satchidananda, which I believe I referenced in an earlier episode. And he really lays out this idea as well that we have to think about each of these yamas, each of these sublimbs, in terms of thought, word, and deed. So that's one of the ways we can create more subtlety in them and more nuance, is think about how we can practice this thing in our minds, in the way we think, in our habitual thought patterns, how we can think about this, whatever the precept is, in the way that we're talking, and then also in the actual things that we're doing. And then we also think about it for self, but then also for others. So for every one of these, we have multiple different layers, multiple different angles, multiple different lenses through which we can consider the precept. So it makes it more versatile in our lives and more meaningful in our lives. One of the things I want to say about Yama and Niyama, the ethical precepts, is that for each one of us, I believe that there'll be some sort of a line in the sand. So we might decide, for example, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this because, again, it can take 20 minutes just on its own. But for example, let's look at the very first one, ahimsa. And ahimsa means, basically, nonviolence. Sometimes people say non-harming. And it's maybe interesting here too, in a previous episode we talked about the word avidya as the first of the kleshas, and I reminded you that oftentimes when we see this at the beginning of the word, it's a negation of whatever follows. So in this context, that the part of the word himsa actually means something like violence or harming, and negates it. So this is non-violence or non-harming. And one of the things I like to think about in terms of these restraints and thinking about the things we shouldn't do is how might we be able to cultivate the opposite? So for example, if I want to practice nonviolence, I want to practice non-harming, what I might be able to cultivate in this case is gentleness or kindness, or even generosity. So I can think about what I don't want to do, and I can also think about what are the qualities that I could cultivate that would mitigate that, or would be like an antidote to it. So I'm just going to give this example for the idea of like the line in the sand. Ahimsa, nonviolence. You will find people who will say to you that to be a yogi and to really be practicing and to be practicing ahimsa, you absolutely must be a vegetarian. And then someone else might even say, well, what does vegetarian mean to you? Like, are you one of those vegetarians that say, but I still eat fish, so that's not really a vegetarian? Or someone might say to you, well, vegetarianism, I mean, you're still eating eggs and milk, and that's not very good, so really, you should be vegan if you're actually practicing non-harming. And then someone else might say, well, actually, even if you're vegan, how do you know that the vegetables and the fruits that you're pulling up are also not sentient? How do you know that they that they enjoy being, or they don't complain or suffer when they're pulled away? So maybe you would actually say you have to be a fruitarian, because a fruitarian only would eat food that had already dropped off of the tree, off of the plant. So in effect, it's already lived its life. So, but someone on the other end might say, well, actually being a vegetarian, and you'll hear this, I used to be a vegetarian, but I felt terrible. I felt really bad all the time, and my body, I had a lot of pain and I felt lethargic, and so my naturopath actually told me that I should start to eat and add a little bit of meat into my diet, because otherwise I was harming myself and actually I wasn't feeling as good. Or maybe someone who is going through a particular medical treatment, or sometimes women who are pregnant will say, well, I used to be vegetarian, but since I've been pregnant, I just need so much more energy and more protein, and I feel that I get that from meat. Who's to say that I'm not harming my unborn baby if I don't provide that sort of nutrition to the baby? So to me, one of the things to think about when we're working with any one of these precepts is that they're very individual to each one of us. And in fact, yoga actually is an extremely individual and personal practice, although because of the way it's taught in groups here, and because of our sort of uneasy relationship with like these gurus, or we have a teacher and they, we're practicing Jiva Mukti yoga, and our teachers are Sharon Gannon and David Life, and they tell us this one thing about veganism, and so that must be the truth. Well, all of a sudden, this practice, this philosophy is becoming something that is offered as sort of like this group, this blanket statement. And even when we look back historically on yoga, which even historically has so many different like meanings and ideas to different people at different times, you can't really find one single mandate telling you what to do. The thing that comes through everything is the idea that this is a personal practice. It's about personal evolution. It's about your own deep self-inquiry and changing and evolving based on where you are and what you have access to, and what all the influences are on your life. So when we think about Yama and Niyama, what we really want to think about is for each one of us, where's our own personal line in the sand? And I'll tell you that in my time practicing, sometimes my line in the sand has gotten closer in. Like I don't know, like I am a vegetarian, and there's been times then when I've like maybe I ate fish, and then I pull that in and I go, that's not vegetarian, I don't want to eat anything that has been alive in that way, so I'm going to pull my line in the sand in this way. Sometimes that's what happens as we mature and evolve and have more life experiences, but sometimes maybe it's the other way. Sometimes maybe it goes the other way. Like I used to, my line in the sand goes further away. So, well, I used to think that I couldn't accept, whatever it was, but now as I've matured a little bit more, I've been able to be a little bit more flexible. So sometimes the line in the sand goes the other way. So I think that's a helpful way to think about these, that you as the individual practicing these precepts, you're really working hard at sort of turning them over in your mind, thinking of them in a lot of different ways, figuring out where do you stand right now, and are you comfortable with where you stand right now? Does this feel like the right place? Or now that you have more information, maybe you want to actually draw that line in the sand in closer, or maybe you want to draw that line in the sand a little further. So that's the way I think we should think about both Yama and Niyama, as these personal practices that could be changing as we mature. So the first one being nonviolence, non-harming. I think without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, and where all those lines in the sand might be, I think we could think about ways that we can really start to practice this or recognize the way that we're practicing it. So for this one example, if we thought about in real life, we might say in real life, non-harming, let's say if I say in thought, I'm going to be less judgmental, right? So there's a quote, thoughts travel far, you become what you think. And now I don't remember if that's attributed to the Buddha or Swami Vivekananda, one of those two. But this idea that whatever the thought patterns are in our mind, they actually do matter. So I might, in my life, saying, I want to practice non-harming, I want to stop being so judgmental. Maybe in word, I can think about decreasing or stopping gossip, right? So if I want to practice gentleness in my words, I don't gossip about other people. Or perhaps when I have the urge to say like, oh, that person was like such a jerk, I could change it around and say, I was feeling frustrated by that person because they seemed like they had a lot of questions that seemed irrelevant to the group, something like that. We can start to change around the way that we're talking to create that sense of gentleness and non-harming. And then maybe indeed, non-harming, maybe in that case I would decide that I don't have to kill, I mean actually even Mexico, like I don't even have to kill every cockroach that I see, right? That might be a line in the sand for you. But in my deed, I might say that I no longer, or I don't want to hurt any living things. Or indeed, I might say, oh goodness, let's just leave it at that. So you can think about the ways the deeds seem a little bit more easy. And then I can also think about for myself and for others, right? So we said for self and others. So maybe for myself, it would be stop having negative self-thought about me. So, you know, I see my body changing as I age, for example, and I become aware of those messages that are coming from outside, like, oh, this is no good, this aging body isn't what the other body should look like, whatever. And I notice that, and I make an effort that I'm not going to think those thoughts for myself, or I'm going to become aware of those thoughts, and I'm going to think of something else, which is another sutra. When a negative thought arises, see if you can replace it with something that's more positive. And then in myself, words, same thing. I might stop using words about myself, like, oh, I'm so stupid, or oh, I don't know what it is. Whatever negative thing I might say about myself, that I don't have to say it anymore, and I can learn not to. And then same thing indeed, and this can bring us to the mat. I can think about, well, I don't want to do this to myself. Like, I don't want to do 100 chaturangas because my shoulder hurts, right? So I can think about how that idea of ahimsa also applies to me. So is reflexive backwards. So if I think about ahimsa on the mat, non-harming on the mat, then again, I can go through that whole process, thought, word, deed, but I can think about, okay, non-harming on the mat, I don't want to do anything that's going to compromise my shoulder that's already aching, let's say. So that is ahimsa, the very first one, non-violence, non-harming. We don't have time to go through that process with each one, so what I want to do is just tell you the other ones, maybe give a quick example as time permits, but have you go back and think about to self, to others, thought, word, deed, and where's the line in the sand, but that line in the sand is changing over your lifetime. So we have ahimsa. The next one is satya. And satya is generally thought of as truthfulness, so not lying. So we could think about that. How do I do that in my thoughts? How am I not truthful in my thoughts? How am I not truthful in my words? How am I not truthful in my actions? We can think about like lies by omission. all of that kind of thing. But we can also think about a different kind of truth, like a greater truth. This actually comes from this verb set, which is to be. All right, that's the end of that marker. To be. So sometimes I also like to translate this one, satya, being with what is. So it's like being with the truth of what's happening now. So, for example, in order for us to deal with this upcoming Trump presidency, I know for me, I keep thinking like this has got to be some kind of a nightmare. There has to be something that's going to change it. There's got to be some new thing that's going to come in to make this guy go away. And all those thoughts, all they do is just rattle around in my brain. They don't allow me to just stop and say, this is what's happening. Like, this is actually happening. This guy is actually going to be, or when you're watching this, is, or hopefully when you're watching it, was our president. That's the truth of what is. And from that truthful place, now I can step into my next action with more clarity. So that's also satya, acknowledging the truth of what's happening right now so we can actually be with it. Then we have asteya, and asteya is non-stealing. So this one we can think of like non-stealing of things, obviously, but we can also think about someone gives you the wrong change or someone forgets to charge you for something. And you can start to think about, well, it would actually be stealing if I didn't pay for that thing, even though it was the other person's error. I still know that, right? So we can start to think about that. Maybe that's stealing. We can also I think a lot about stealing energy, right? Like someone's like, oh my gosh, I just saw the best movie, you're gonna love it. And you're like, oh, I already saw that movie. You know what's actually a better movie is blah, 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 blah. Like right in that moment, what we've done is actually stolen that person's excitement or their energy. So we can think about stealing in that way too. Going back to satya, on the mat, we could just think about like, this is how my body moves. Like it doesn't put my leg behind my head, or this is where I am in my headstand, or this is how my body's changed for this week because I have a wrist injury. I can just be with that. With asteya, on the mat, we can think about not stealing from the other people in our class. So even the idea of someone, you know, they finally get to do a handstand and our first thought is like, oh my gosh, that person's such a show off. Even if it's in our mind, right? Like we've stolen something from that other person. And then we can also think about on ourselves, like when we're on our mat and we're comparing ourselves to someone else, we're stealing from the moment at hand. And if we're comparing ourselves negatively, we're even stealing from our own good feelings. So that's asteya, non-stealing. It's one of the precepts we really work with and we really take seriously in order to evolve. Then we have a parigraha. Actually, if we can go in order, it's usually listed brahmacharya. And brahmacharya is really the idea of celibacy. And that's a lot to unpack. If you don't have my book already, I would suggest you read this one on celibacy, especially the one where I'm talking about a priest talking to me about the vow of celibacy. But it's this idea of drawing in and managing all of our energy. So sometimes people call it moderation or continence. So I can just think about, I go to yoga class and I just got over a cold, I just only have a little bit of energy. Then I don't have to work at 115%. I can just work at, say, 75%, really to contain my energy. Or I have something I need to do later on. I can think about how am I going to manage that energy. So really thinking about this idea of energy management is the crux of brahmacharya. And then we have just one last one. And again, I really encourage you to think about thought, word, deed, self and others, in life, on the mat, that line in the sand. But the last one is a parigraha. It's usually translated as non-grasping. We could also say non-attachment, non-hoarding. So this is really that idea that I don't have to like hold on to everything so tightly, or I don't have to hold on to that old pair of pants that one day I hope to fit in again, or I'm eventually going to sew that one pocket. It's the ability to just let things go on the physical plane, but also on the mental plane, and also to cultivate generosity, right? So if someone wants something and I have it, I don't have to say, well, oh no, those are mine. I actually need 4 of those, it makes it easier for me to say, well, of course, you can have 1 or 2 or all 4 because I'm practicing that non-grasping. So those are the yamas, quick and dirty. I hope that was helpful. Also in my book, there's extensive description of each one of the yamas and the yamas. So hope that helps, and have a fabulous day. Que te vaya muy bien. Adios.